The functionality will be identical, so what we'll do to start with is compare this step with our next step. So I'm going to go to the resource pack directory, and I'm going to open up this 10th step here, which is called CRUD edit form refactored. Let's copy the code here and paste it over the code that's currently in the test.php file and save it. And to compare, we'll use a file comparison tool. I'm going to go back to the resource pack directory and drag the 9th step over to the left side of the comparison tool, and the 10th step here over to the right side, and I'm going to click compare. So if we scroll down here just to get a sense of the scope of the changes, you can see a big chunk of changes right here. And then if we scroll down, you see a big chunk of changes over here on the left. These two sections that you see are actually mostly the same code, except because they're in different parts of the file, it's hard for the file comparison utility to identify that or explain the fact that code has switched places here. So if we scroll down, you see that the bulk of the changes is actually in this big chunk of code right here that appears on the left of there and appears on the right here. But let's start at the top. So our first change has to do with how we output HTML lists when we begin with an array. So our strategy has been to use an implode function and then wrap a list item tag and an unordered list tag around that. Now, this is generally kind of good functionality. We might want to use it in various other places too, without having to write that code. So what we did was convert that to a function called array_to_list, and then we just pass it the array, and it returns the HTML list. So this was just one place where it seemed like there was a good general application to this functionality, so it was worthwhile to put it into a separate function. Okay, let's keep scrolling down here. Now our next change is in the add form function. Before we had one parameter, now we have two. Now the idea here is to take any place where we're mentioning a post or a get variable inside of our code and replace it with something that the user can supply. So there's more potential functionality here. For example, we could run this add form function and pre-populate it with a list of data that came from some other place. And to get the same functionality that we have now, when the user submits the add form and it fails and it pre-populates with information that they submitted, this will be the post variables here. So as you scroll down, you see that the changes here all have to do with using that values instead of the post variable. So over here, you see post being used several times. Over here, all of those have been replaced with values. I'm going to go ahead and scroll to the left again, and then keep scrolling here. And we have a new function called validate submission. So in order to put this into context, let's see where this is called. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to do a search for the function name, and we see it right here in the add edit entry function. Now this is a new function as well. You can see by the way that we're comparing the file here that all of this code is being added right here, which means that it's new. So this function is called when we're going to add or edit an entry. Before we had our validate functionality happening inline here. So you see we do the required validation, and if we keep scrolling down, it'll take us a little while. We would get the numeric validation and alphanumeric validation and so on. And after that, if we had no errors, we would begin processing our code to create the SQL queries that would eventually either update or insert the entry into the database. But let's go ahead and scroll up here again so we can see the differences. This function here, which we're going to come back to in a moment, validate submission, will actually take care of that validation part. If we scroll up here, I'm going to keep scrolling up until we get back to the validate submission function. This takes two parameters, values and action. The values are going to be aligned with what got submitted in the form, but again, we might want to use this for some other purpose, to validate a submission from another source, for example. And then the action is either going to be add or edit, and we need to know that in order to know whether to do certain validation, for example, on the uniqueness of the username. So the structure here is super similar. We have the errors array here, and we add to the errors array as we go through. Every time you see values here, this used to be a post variable. And if we scroll down at the end, we're going to return that array of errors. If we continue to scroll down to look at the add edit entry function, again, this is what processes the added or edited entry. Here's our errors being returned as part of that validate submission function. And if there are errors, we're going to return the form using the add form function. And we're passing null for the username, but we're passing the values back that got passed to add edit entry for populating the form again. And then if there weren't any errors, we're going to go ahead and process the query, and everything here is the same as well, except we're using this values array instead of the post array again. Let's scroll down a bit here. We also added a delete entry function. This is something that I talked about earlier. We pass it the username, and it will delete the user from the database and add a notice about it. Now, we can see these in action if we scroll down to the point where our script starts to look the same again here at the switch statement around the action. So now instead of doing any processing within the switch statement, we're pushing everything to functions. So instead of processing the deletion here, we instead call the delete function. We instead call the delete entry function. Instead of processing, validating, and submitting the form here, like we do on this side, we're actually using the add edit entry function. And depending on if there are any errors, it may return the form again. So we're going to add that back to the output. If we keep scrolling down to the very bottom, everything else here is the same.